a very warm welcome. As you are aware, this is a webinar that's being conducted in collaboration between the Climate Adaptation Research Program and the African Doctoral Academy. And today we have with us Professor René Pellissier, who is going to talk about how to apply project management tools to successfully implement your research project. And as many of us in this webinar are working on climate adaptation projects, she'll throw in some examples around climate adaptation too. I see some of you have already introduced yourselves in the chat and told us where you're joining from. If you haven't done that, please say hi. It's really wonderful to see so many of you with us today, and also just to see the representation across different countries. We're all calling in from different corners of Africa and possibly elsewhere as well. So a very warm welcome. So to start, I'm just going to say a quick few words about the CARP program. I know many of you guys, of course, know what CARP is since you are a current CARP scholar. But I do see that we have a number of people who are not part of the current CARP cohort. So if you're unaware, CARP stands for the Climate Adaptation Research Program, which is a new program that's been running for about a year now. And the overall aim is to foster or build this new generation of researchers in the Global South who focus on the impacts and the implications of climate change for disaster risk reduction policies and strategies. So far, CARP has been focused only in Africa. So for the last year, we have been working very closely with some of the people in this webinar right now, as well as others, to go through a proposal process and learn about what their research interests are. And we have funded 33 research projects across 11 countries in Africa. And in each of these research projects is made up of a research team. And overall, there are more than 125 researchers that we're supporting. And this is with funding from the US Agency for International Development, so USAID. We recently had a collaborative workshop at RD University in Tanzania, where we got to meet a lot of our current CARP scholars. So that was a really wonderful experience. And we are going to be having more in-person workshops as well as these online webinars, such as the one today. We also recently found out some very good news that we are going to be expanding the CARP program. So from next year onwards, we're going to have more calls for proposals and more opportunities to fund research projects that focus on climate adaptation and disaster risk reduction. So do keep an eye on communications from us about that. And we're not only expanding the program within Africa, but we're also going to be funding projects and providing technical support to scholars in the Latin America and Caribbean region, as well as the Pacific Island region. So yeah, that's some really exciting stuff from CARP. Another goal of the CARP program is around community building. So we do aim to create this active community of scholars, as well as practitioners and decision makers and other stakeholders who are all working to meet the challenges of climate change, as well as responding to climate-related disasters. So if you're interested in participating as a community member of CARP, please do get in touch with us. Hi there. I'm just looking at the chat and I see some of our CARP scholars are joining, so it's really lovely to see all of you. Just a quick logistics note for those who are part of CARP. I know some of you might have to jump off early, so I wanted to get this out of the way now. But the next CARP webinar we are planning is for December. And during this webinar, we're going to give you an update on our communication strategy and some of the stuff we've been working on since the workshop in Tanzania. We'll also give updates on our reporting and invoicing timelines, and just have a friendly check-in with the CARP scholars to just find out how you're all doing with your projects, and to, give some logistics and admin updates. But now that all of that stuff's out of the way, I'm going to pass over to Natalie Kowalik, who is going to say a couple words maybe about ADA. I don't know if you want to do that, Natalie, and also introduce our esteemed guest speaker for today, Professor René Pellissier. So over to you, Natalie.
Thanks very much, Julia. I appreciate it. And also welcome to all of the people that are joining for the webinar today. My name is Natalie Kowalik. I'm the Program Manager for the African Doctoral Academy here at Stellenbosch University. At Stellenbosch, we have various summer and winter schools as part of the African Doctoral Academy that we host on an annual basis, looking at doctoral training for doctoral students, as well as master students, as well as researchers and new supervisors. More information about that can be found on our website. But my job today is actually to introduce you to our lovely guest speaker, and that is Professor René Pellissier. So Professor Pellissier is an international consultant, strategic and research specialist. She heads the Southern African Regional Universities Association's Climate Change and Sustainable Development Program, including the development of transdisciplinary curricula for master's program in climate change and sustainable development for the SADC region. She also heads the German Industrialization Organization for Industrial Pharmacy Fellowships across SADC, and she has been involved in the design and development of several European Union grants. In her other work, Professor Pellissier heads up the Cape Higher Education Leadership Academy, where she designs and facilitates leadership development programs in higher education and presents several workshops. Furthermore, she works as a strategist, a researcher, and a systems engineer in the international arena based on her extensive international experience across universities in the United States, United Kingdom, France, and across Africa. Her specializations are technology and innovation in complex adaptation systems. Professor Pellissier is a professor of research and innovation in South Africa and a professor of information management in the UK. She holds an MSc in mathematical statistics, an MBA, and a PhD in industrial engineering for systems engineering. So we will be opening the floor to questions during the presentation. So please feel free to ask your questions in the chat or Q&A section, and my colleagues Julia and Luther will also be assisting with the questions during the presentation. And then also just a reminder to everybody that the session is being recorded and will also be made available after the presentation, as well as the presentation itself. So welcome. And now I hand over the platform to Professor René Pellissier. Welcome.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Natalie. Thank you, Julia. Good afternoon, everyone. It's wonderful to be here and to also see so many from Africa, different regions in Africa. So I was going to ask that you put in the chat which country you're coming from, but you're preempting that. So let me just ask those who haven't done that, just show the country that you're coming from. And while you're doing that, let me thank the ADA and CARP for inviting me to participate in this event. When we started chatting about a possible masterclass in research from a project point of view, I was quite intrigued by that because I thought I knew everything about research. But this was something that I actually didn't think about before. And it challenged me to bring something together from my erstwhile subject area plus my research experience into something that I think is worthwhile just to keep note of and keep track of as we move forward. So I really appreciate the invitation from both Julia and Natalie and Alberto, and hope that as we move along, there's value in the presentation this afternoon. I will try, and I'll commit myself to that, not to be too boring, provided that you commit yourself to being engaging and participating in the work as we continue. Some of my colleagues will be watching the chat, And I'm also going to ask you some activities as we move along, just so that we all talk about the possibilities of all of this. Let me just see which countries you are from. South Africa, and then I saw Ethiopia earlier on. And Dar es Salaam, Tanzania. Thank you for that. So starting this off, I would like to ask you, why are you here? What is it that you're wanting to get out of this? You saw the invitation and it looked like, oh, let's take 2 hours out of my day and let's go see what this is about and what I can learn. So why are you here? Can you just put in the chat, why are you here? Or if anyone feels that they want to switch on their cameras and unmute themselves and just give me an indication, what are your expectations? Why are you here today? Anyone in the chat, or switch on your cameras that we can see you and unmute yourself and indicate to us why you're here. What did you think you might gain from this, so that we have sort of a job description for me, and then at the end we can see that I do any of that. So why are you here? The sound is a bit low. Would like to have a more structured way, a more structured approach to research from a project perspective. That's good. Anyone else? All right. So what is research? What do we do when we use the word research? What do we do? Anyone in the chat, or unmute yourselves? Why do we do research? What is it about? And you'd better answer, because my next question would be, why do we need to do research in the climate space? So why do we do research, and why do we need to do research in the climate space? Anyone? Anyone? Yeah, you're reminding me of a song that predates any one of you, and that is Pink Floyd. They had a song, and in the song it goes, "Is there anybody out there?" Now I'm going to have to ask that at some point. So
René, I see there's quite a few answers coming through in the chat.
Okay.
New
approaches. Thank you, Julia. Specific problems, to address specific problems or challenges, to introduce new approaches, to have an understanding of research as a project. All right. Best practices. Keen to follow up my master's with a PhD. Brilliant, Amanda. Brilliant. And also in terms of policy change, because that's the ultimate reason why we're conducting research. You need a solid foundation. Okay. So climate change is moving forward so fast that whatever theory there is almost cannot keep up with what's happening. Why is that? Because the population of the earth is outgrowing the resources of the earth, for one. And secondly, because we are really messing up what the resources are that we're having, which means that the challenges are growing beyond what we can do from the previous research. So we need to continually adapt towards what new problems exist and how can we solve them. And the trick in climate change for me, in mitigation, adaptation, in risk mitigation, is really that it becomes very transdisciplinary, i.e., one size doesn't fit all, and we need a growing group of people to work together from different perspectives to work on climate change. Maybe I'm saying that because I need to justify why I'm here, because I'm an industrial engineer in a climate environment. But the reason is that over the last 3 years, we've worked in the Southern African Regional Association of Universities towards building capacity development in SADC around climate change. And the more we worked together, the more issues came about, the more we realized that there's more that we need to put in, because the experience, the place is so evolving. So saying that, we need to look at the research from how do we design the research, because the problems keep on coming up. So maybe research is like designing a car. We have a sense of what we want to achieve on the outcome side. That's fancy car, maybe. But really what needs to go into this are the components of the car that we need to bring in the right way, in the right time, in the right format to produce that car. That car doesn't come because we draw a picture of this car. It comes by unpacking it into its elements and then understanding how these elements work together. And that is designing and building the car. Now, if I translated that to adaptation and risk, then how do we go about doing that? So I'm going to give you 2 examples and then we'll actually start. First example comes out of the Netherlands. Now, as you know, the Netherlands is surrounded by water. Most of the land is actually below sea level. So just that leads to a lot of different research projects that could be undertaken within that country in order to adapt and mitigate the issues that they have. So here I've listed some of the possible issues that they may be looking at towards research in water management in the Netherlands. And there are different methods that one can use in order to solve some of these problems that they will then be identifying. The thing with research doesn't matter unless we make it matter. So we could continue doing research, but if it's doesn't have practical value, which is known as mode 3 knowledge production, i.e. the research needs to be earthed in a value to society, in whoever that society is. So there's got to be impact from the research. And in all these possible problems, focus areas that are here that they can continue to identify, what really matters is the outcome of that research needs to have value to society. So here's another example that's probably closer to home for you. Here's drought resilience in Botswana. So there's a huge issue around water resources that impact on the overarching economy of Botswana based on drought. So there's a range of different focus areas that Botswana could look at in terms of doing research in this field. And additionally, a range of different methods they could use. And again, the question is, why does that matter? So, and the only answer for that is, make sure when the research is conducted that the picture of that perfect car is a picture that has value to society. So how does that matter in terms of the research? So with that said, we will deal with the following. I'm going to do a 3-part series today. Firstly, we'll look at a view of research from a project perspective. Then we'll do exactly what I just said, planning with the end in mind. And then thirdly, we'll do a practical application. We'll ask you to try some of the content of what we're doing here today. At some point, I'm going to ask you to go to Mentimeter. There's the code, but I'll remind you of the code later on. You can actually just sit here and with your with your phone, just do a screen print of what I'll show you, or you can go to that link and then we'll do some engagement about this. Are there any comments about the plan or where we're going with this today before we start? Anything anyone wants us to add? Anything? You're very quiet.
I don't see any questions, René, about the content, just a couple of more comments about why people are here. And Franken says that he's currently registered for a short course in climate change mitigation and adaptation strategies for sustainable livelihoods, and is hoping to learn more so that he can do research in the field. So that sounds like a good, topic area that this webinar is very relevant to. So there we go.
Thank you very much, Julia. Colleagues, I'm going to switch off my video because I tend to use my hands a lot and I don't want to detract from the presentation itself. So you've seen me now, you can see me again later, but I'm going to switch off my video and just talk with you. Okay, so the first of the three part is talking about the processes that we use from a project perspective in terms of research. Now, the thing is, planning a research project in this field means that we got to integrate the scientific principles that we know from research with practical solutions. Now, that means that we got to marry what is on the left-hand side and what is on the right-hand side. On the left-hand side is the typical rigorous research side. So we talk about what is it that we want to do? What is the justification for doing that? When do we want to do that? Who do we want to do that? And where do we want to do that? It's the typical, almost heuristic of what research as a process is about. Then research from a project point of view looks at it slightly differently. Now we're talking about outcomes, deliverables. I wanted to say milestones, and then I wrote another deliverables there. Milestones, timelines. What are the resources, the infrastructure, excuse me, the activities, the dependencies. So it looks at it from a completely different point of view. And in making research successful in this field, we need to bring these two together into one and ensure. So how familiar are you with research as a process? If I asked you, what is it that you want to do? And why do you want to do that? Can you answer those research questions? What would you say in terms of what is it that I want to do? And can you justify, I'm going to do this because why? It has value in terms of X, Y, Z. And then the third three of those questions on the left-hand side are to do with how will we do this? So are you thinking about what is it that you want to do and why? Because then once you have an understanding of what you want to do, then we move to the other side where research now becomes a project. You have an understanding of what you want to do. Excuse me. And we now focus on how will we achieve this? What are the activities, the timelines, and the dependencies? So here are the words in project management. And these words are the ones on the left. First one is, what is a project scope? You'll hear us talk about a project scope. I'll show you now what they are. A very important terminology is, what are the milestones, the outcomes of the project? What are the tasks in the project? What is the critical path? Has anyone of you heard the term critical path before? Who knows what a critical path is? Anyone? We'll talk about the critical path and the timeline. What are the dependencies between the activities? What are the resources that we need? What about risk? Where will this project break down? Who are the stakeholders involved? What does the ethical approval mean to us, and how do we get that? What are the deliverables? The mitigation strategies if something can go wrong. Where does peer review fit in? A large part of project management has to do with the evaluation of the project at different stages of the project, which leads us to the project life cycle phases. So this is what they mean. The project scope will show to who reads this, what are the goals? What is it that we want to achieve on the outcome? What are the deliverables? What are the tasks that we define for the project? That leads us to the milestones. Those are the typical outcomes in the small phases of the project that we need to tick off, and they will tell the person reading this that I have achieved, or I'm in the process of achieving this research. For instance, if you're doing this as, Don't know what just happened. Apologies. If you're doing this for the purposes of a master's degree or a doctoral degree, then the research proposal will be a first milestone to achieve. Getting funding for your research project will be a milestone to achieve. Then some of the tasks will be the initial literature review or the data collection or the other activities that you conduct in the research. What is a critical path? That is the longest time that it can take to complete the project in the shortest possible time. It's the longest way that we can perform these tasks that we get to the end result in the shortest time. Does that make sense to you? So how can we fit in all the possible problems that can take place? We're going to conduct this project in 24 months. Maybe we can do it in 20 months, but we're going to say 24 months. That is the longest time to ensure that the project takes place and everything can happen in what it does. If we can conduct this in a shorter time, great. If not, the critical path is that path with all the tasks that are important to complete the project. So the timeline will be the timelines of all the different activities in that critical path to conduct the project. But that can only happen if we identify which of these tasks may have dependencies between them, i.e., which ones cannot take place if something else has not already taken place. It has to wait for another one to take place. So, resources. What do we need in order to complete the project? Do we need funding? Do we need to appoint field workers to conduct the research? What do we need in order to conduct the research? Then, what about risk? What if things go wrong? How do we develop a risk matrix as part of our proposal to indicate to the reader or the funder that we have looked into what can go wrong and we're ready to fix that and make that work? Who's going to be involved? Do we have an idea of who's going to be involved? Have we identified everyone who's involved, from the funding agencies to regulatory authorities to the academic communities? Do we know who's involved? Do we know whether we need ethical approval for this? Example, working for the SADC Secretariat like I do, I know that they don't have a formal process for ethical approval, which makes it very dangerous for projects that I'm involved in, because we have to find another way to protect the project if the ethical approval cannot come from a specific body that is the overarching organization. And the funding agency may or may not help you towards that. Then what is it that we need to achieve? What are the tangible or the intangible goods that we need to deliver? What are the plans we need to put in place? How will we evaluate the findings of the research? How do we ensure that the findings that we have are validated? How do we evaluate the project towards the end to ensure we've made everything work? And what are the stages of the project that we can tick off where we are in the project? So those are the typical terms that we use in project management when we plan research as a project. I'll just go through them again. The project scope, that would be in terms of, I want to walk up Kilimanjaro. At the end of this project is that view from the top of Kilimanjaro down below into the valley. The milestones would be those activities or even parts of the journey that I need to do in order to get me up the mountain. The critical path would be, what is the journey? What is the best journey for me to go up the mountain? What is the typical timeline? What are the dependencies? What things need to happen at the same time And the one is based on the other because that can impact on the completion of the project. What are the resources I need to go up the mountain? Who should I take with me? What goes into my backpack? What are the typical risks in going up to the mountain? Who are the stakeholders in my journey? I probably don't need ethical approval for that. What are the deliverables in my journey up the mountain? It could just be the picture at the top, or my journey in terms of showing what I've achieved. What are the mitigation strategies if I know that things could go wrong? How do I evaluate, or how do I provide a sense of evaluation in terms of what I've done, in terms of the findings and in terms of the project itself? And a big thing in project management is monitoring and evaluation, which is M&E. How do I build in a sense of monitoring so that I can measure what I am busy achieving? Is that a mouthful, or are you okay with that? So this is what it looks like. So in engineering, we call this the V model, V model in engineering. And it says that everything in terms of a product or a project starts with the definition and the development. Then it goes down into the head of the V in terms of the specifics. And then it goes back up the other side in terms of verification and validation. Starting on the left-hand side from the big picture, it means in research that we need to identify what is the broad research area. Then from that, build a conceptual design which will look at the goals, the objectives, the research problem, what is it that we want to achieve. Then the next phase in terms of implementation will look towards how do I do that? It's purely just development still. I haven't actually done it, but I'm planning from the broad outcome down to the detail into the nook of the V where the data actually comes. Now I have a preliminary design. I know what I want to achieve, and I've got the research design and methodology set up, and I know what data I need to collect. Then up the other side, now that I get into the verification and validation stages, there's a pilot study. Normally we do a pilot testing. Then we do the actual data collection and data analysis. We write the findings and the outcomes. Then we do the dissemination. Research is not valuable if it stays with ourselves. In research, we talk about science in reach and science outreach. Science in reach is if we talk amongst each other. Academics are very good about that. They try and brag about what they've achieved in a conference or in the corridors, but they keep it amongst themselves. It's science in reach. You talk to the cronies in the field. Maybe they're impressed, maybe they're not. The real value of research lies in science outreach, which is how do I explain in normal language to the person who is not familiar with the technical terms what I have achieved, and how do I show that the research has meaning and impact on the output side. That's real dissemination. It moves from research in reach, science in reach, to science outreach, where this research becomes disseminated to the general public. And then the last phase in this V model is sustainability, learning, and innovation, which means once the project is completed, can this be sustained? And what are the lessons learned, which goes back to the left-hand side of the V model, and the V model can stand again. So the V model is a high-level summary looking at the research from defining the research, setting it up for development, going down the left-hand side of the V from the broad area to the conceptual design and the goals and objectives and research questions or question, depending on what you have, identifying the research problem, to developing the research implementation plan, the proposal, to what is the data that we need, which is now the preliminary design, and then up the other side of the V in terms of pilot testing, data analysis, data collection and data analysis, the findings and the outcomes written up, then disseminated in terms of science inreach, but certainly also in terms of science outreach. And then the loop closes back to the left-hand side, because we've got to indicate that the research outcomes are sustainable and that there is learning that took place. And the nice thing about the V model is what I've just done in terms of the yellow arrows. Everything on the left-hand side, as we drill down into the detail, need to be aligned with everything on the right-hand side. So as we planned the research on the right-hand side of the V model, the planning needs to relate to what came out of it, which means, and that's probably your first lesson on project management in research, as you go down the left and you will know that you're going to come out on the right-hand side, make sure that the right-hand side can happen, because the right-hand side is where the actual implementation takes place. And it can't happen if the left-hand side wasn't solid enough. You planned in a vacuum. You were walking up Kilimanjaro, but you ended up walking around the mountain. So can the right-hand side happen? And how many stages do you have on the right-hand side linking back to see, in terms of monitoring and evaluation, did I do what I actually set myself out to do? Am I on track? Am I on track? And that can only happen if the project phases on the left are clearly identified, so that once we get to the right-hand side and the milestones on the right-hand side, they link to what we planned on the left-hand side. And my opinion is you spend more time planning the research than you actually think that you should be doing, because if the planning is perfect, the rest falls into place relatively easily. I'm waiting for comments if there are any, or questions if there are any. If not, I'm going to ask you to work with me. Let's look at what the steps are in a research project of this nature. Now, before I give you what I did, just tell me in the chat, or you can just shout out, what are the typical steps that you think we need to do when we conduct research? What are the steps? I'm checking the chat. Where do we start? You want to conduct a research project. So if you were doing this for a master's or a doctoral degree, you walk to the supervisor or a potential supervisor and say, what do you have as ideas for me, or not? Where do you start your research? What's the first step? Define the problem. How do you define the problem, Amanda? The same, Anthony, with identify a gap in the research niche. How do you do that? Where do you look?
Sorry, I'm unmuting myself. It's easier than typing. My name's Amanda. For me, is sort of seeing in the area that you're working in something that needs an answer. So if sorry, I'm in the healthcare industry. I'm not in climate change, but if I look at disaster management, so how can we solve a problem that is seen every seasonal rain that we have in our country? You know, so it's sort of identifying what the problem is that I want the answers to. I want to know.
Right,
like,
so Amanda, you're right. You were going to start working on a PhD, I remember from the chat, right?
Considering it, yes.
Good, good. Let's help you continue to consider that in a positive light. So your research problem that you're wanting to explore will come from where?
So mine was implement enablers and to the implementation of Trauma Society accreditation in South Africa. So I saw that there was a need for emergency departments to be accredited. There is a system, and I was wanting to understand why people hadn't adopted the system in order to have their units accredited. So that was, my master's was around that. I just did it in the private sector, but I'm wanting to look at it as a South African perspective.
Cool. Thank you. Well said. So let's listen to what Amanda just said. She's identified where her niche is. So I've just given you my list of possible steps. They're not necessarily correct. There may be some that can go, others that you can add, but that's a basic list. But the first thing and the most important thing is to identify the topic, a researchable problem, and a research question. But Amanda didn't give me that. Sorry to isolate you now, but you were nice enough to give me your example. So the second takeout of the day for me would be, do you identify a researchable problem? Now, the way in which this was phrased does not indicate to me a researchable problem. It indicates a possible gap, which is what one of the others said in the chat. It indicates a gap, but it doesn't give me a researchable problem. And one of the important factors in conducting doctoral research is the assessor, the examiner will check, could you identify a researchable problem? Not a problem, a researchable problem. Were you able to use your analytical skills at the Bloom's taxonomy level 8 or 9 or 10, depending on what degree you were doing this, if it is for a degree? Were you able to recognize where the problem lies? And it's very easy to sort of feel that the problem is the same as what you're wanting to do, but they're not. The problem is the origin of the entire body of work that you want to develop to address and answer that problem. So you have to write about the topic, which means the second point here comes into play, which is conduct an initial literature review or scanning of the environment, and then say, here is the problem, the researchable problem that will inform the entire shebang of what I am going to do in this research. But without being able to state that researchable problem, you almost cannot move. You can define the objectives and the scope of the research, so to determine, to identify, to develop, to compare. But those activities that you define under the objectives come because you have identified the researchable problem in your research. And of course, with that problem can come, what is the research question, the overarching question, which is not a yes/no answer. It's a question that leads to the body of knowledge that you are going to create. So the first instance is the initial scanning of the area, identify the topic area, then read about that sufficiently that you are able to state a researchable problem as a problem. And if you like, rephrase that as a research question. Then look at what are the objectives and the scope of the study, because now you know what you're wanting to get to, which is you can say primary objective and secondary objectives, or you can say the goal or the aim of this research is to, and then break that down into milestones, if you go my language about project management, or in terms of secondary objectives, if you go the way in which academic research normally holds. But the researchable problem is a big milestone to achieve, to create the understanding of why this is necessary. Why would somebody give money for this research if you're not solving a problem? And I tell you, there's always a problem. Does that make sense to you? I know there were a couple of you who mentioned a problem. So you're right. It's about the reading. Thanks, Julia. Where were the days when we said we read for a degree? Long past. But back in the day, we were reading for a degree. And back in the old day, the journeyman, those were the people who went from village to village on their ox wagons or their little carts. And they were distributing knowledge and information to the little villages which were far from each other. So the journeyman would go from the one village to the other and share knowledge and information. And sometimes this journeyman would have an apprentice that would be helping him. And that apprentice is the student. And the journeyman is the professor. And you are building the knowledge and then sharing that knowledge to the community. And in the case of academic research, it's based on a researchable problem. You can state it as a research problem if you like, but the research problem has to be researchable. You got to explain it so that it's researchable. So I can say load shedding in South Africa is a big problem. You know, we'll all agree with me because we all sit with all of the nonsense, but that's not a researchable problem. It's just a general problem. I need to turn that into something specific that will open up everything about the work that I'm going to do over the next 1, 2, 3 years based on this question that I asked, this problem that I identified, stated as a problem, and then possibly rephrased as a question. How do you feel about that? So once you've done the initial scan of the literature, of the environment even, and you are able to fine-tune the topic to something more specific, and you've able to identify the problem, the research problem, which is researchable, then you can set the objectives and the scope. If needed, you can bring a team together to do the work. Otherwise, you do it on your own. You then develop the research design and the methods for what you're going to do, and you write all of that up in a research proposal. That proposal can go to a funder, it could go to the university, but it needs to all go into a business plan. Then you need to get funding. You need to explain, as part of your research proposal, for instance, what is the anticipated timeline? And what would you develop over time based on your timeline? Now, typically students would go for chapter 1, chapter 2, chapter 3, chapter 4 as the milestones. Or in a general research project, those milestones could be parts of the research steps if you wanted to. You got to spend some time on the data management plan. What will you do with the data? How will you collect and manage the data? Then conduct a pilot study, execute the research by collecting the data and analyzing the data, engage with the stakeholders that you have identified. If it's a community project, then you've got to be able to engage with the local community in their language and their culture, derive the outputs and the outcomes, disseminate the outcomes. We spoke about science in reach and science outreach. And if you can, make policy recommendations. For me, academic research almost always sits just below the level of absolute importance. I personally think that policy recommendations is the ultimate of research outcome. At the point where we can say, we can now show the way in which this needs to happen at a higher level. So if it's possible to suggest policy recommendations, I think that's a very valuable outcome of the research. And then lastly, the project evaluation and the sustainability of the outcomes post the project. So have you thought about that when you conduct your research? Once you're done and you wash your hands and you say, I got what I wanted out of this one, off you go. I no longer need you. No. Leave that environment or leave that space, that academic space or practical space, with a legacy that can continue. And how do you do that? How do you hand this over that it will be useful? Are there any comments or can I continue? So this is the end of part 1, which is the project management tools, words, foundations, before we now actually go ahead and do that. So at this point, I'll take some questions and then we'll go on with begin with the end in mind. Any questions or comments? Anthony, I like your comment about the literature will be introspected. Look into what has been done. Get yourself at the edge of what has been done. And a lot of you said about the identification of the problem. Yeah, the talk here about the gap is a good point. How do you expect to conduct research if it's already been done? What are you achieving? So what is the gap? What has not been done? If you read other people's research, where did they stop? If we do this across different countries, one country have done a research body around this, but it's not being done in my country, and we have different variables in my country. So how can I replace the research in a different environment, under different settings, and get a more generalized outcome from that research? Any other comments from you? Questions maybe? Nothing. All right, before I continue, wherever you are, we've been at this now for about 45 minutes. Just get up from your chair and do a big stretch and yawn and sit back down again, please. Just get up and have a big stretch with your arms and your legs, and then sit back down, and we'll continue. But just breathe in and breathe out, that your brain can relax. Can you do that? And give me a thumbs up if you've done that. Thumbs up if you've done a stretch and you've sat down again. And we can begin with the end in mind. Thumbs up. Thumbs up. Did you stretch? Now, the reason why I wanted you to do a bit of a stretch is because we're now going to go into how do I actually make this work? So the first terminology that we're now going to apply in research from a project perspective is the concept of milestones. And there's a little picture there showing what a milestone could look like. So you can draw a line of your research, a straight line, and then put little dots on that line to say, here are specific things in the process that I need to do in order to get to the outcome. So anything, just draw a line, and then here's my first activity. I need to get funding. I need to get a supervisor. I need to get a co-supervisor. Oh, I need to know which university I'm going to do this at. Or I need funding for this. Or I need to write the research proposal. What are the steps in your process that are the milestones? This is a big thing. If I've achieved this, I've achieved something. And this you do across the project timeline from the beginning to the end, as the image shows on the left-hand side. And some of the examples of milestones could be when you submit and get approval for your research project, or when you think you've done all the literature review up front that you need to have done. Or I'm now ready to do the data collection, so I'm starting the data collection now, and then maybe I'll finish the data collection at a point in future. Another one could be the data analysis. I've completed the data analysis. Or I've written the interim report, maybe about the data outcomes. I've done a complete draft of the entire research project. I've received review and feedback. I've completed my final project. I've done a presentation about my project. I've published my project. And what about evaluation? So those are typical examples of the milestones in the process of climbing up Kilimanjaro in your research. And you have to identify, when you plan the research, what these milestones will be from day one or day zero to the end of the project. When you get to this is done, what are those big things? Because once you have those big things, those typical milestones, then you can plan, how do I get the best outcome? What is the critical path through my research, which I'll show you now, to get to that research? So here is another milestone. Now it's not just a straight line. It now consists of more activities across the process until I get to the outcome. So that milestones in your timeline could be small, or it could be an elongated one because there's a lot of activities that you need to undertake in order to complete the project. And for each of these milestones, you can actually write down, when should this start and when should this finish? And then you add up all those start and finish times, and that gives you the total project duration. So when I say plan the research, keeping in mind what the end result is, you will identify point 9 here on the image as the outcome of your research. Have I achieved the goal of the research? And then what are the components, the milestone components that I need to put in place to achieve that? And how long will each one of those take me so that I can complete my research within the time that I have to do this? Let's say you have 24 months. If I write down those milestones and I break them up in their time components and they don't add up to 24 months, it means my project cannot be completed. I know that up front because I'm beginning with the end in mind. So work backwards so that you understand what the project milestones, these big things are. And once you have all of them, how long does it take me? There might be certain milestones where they can happen in series, i.e. they can happen at the same time or parallel or in series. So how do you make provision for that? Now, what are you thinking about that? Where does risk fit in? Because if you look at that picture, let me show you again, and one of these things that work the one after the other, let's say between 5 and 6, can't happen. What happens to your outcome in number 9? It can't take place. You're walking up Kilimanjaro, you're halfway up there, you get to, was it first? Well, not halfway. You get to first base up the mountain, and there's a huge storm brewing. You can't get through that. So your timelines will have to change. But if your timeline is fixed and there's a problem somewhere in the milestone system, you will not be able to reach the destination. That means every one of these become a risk. So what risk does, risk identifies all these potential problems that can occur. So you make a list of all of the things that can go wrong. Then you do 2 things, which is point 2 and point 3 here. You identify the likelihood of that happening. How possible is it that that risk event that you identified can happen? Some of them are more possible to happen, others are less possible to happen. Then in number 3, you identify the impact of that. So this can happen, but it doesn't really have an impact on what I'm busy doing. Or this cannot happen, but if it did, the impact on my research is very high. So if I took the risk events and I identified the likelihood of them happening, low, medium, high, and then in addition to that, I identify the impact of each one of these risk events, low, medium, or high, I can actually calculate almost in a probability format what the overall importance of these risk events are. I'll show you now. And once I have that, I can create a mitigation strategy. So it'll look like this. Let's see. So I've identified in my research project on the left-hand side the possible risk events that can impact on my research project. Now, I've worked on many research projects, funded research and academic projects, and most of these can all take place at the same time. So you can have funding delays. You have a project, and you just don't get the funding in when you need it. So how will that hold up the process? At the moment, we're not looking at how likely that is or what the impact of that will be. We're just writing down all the possible risk events that we can think of that can impact on the stream of milestones that we identified and getting to the top of Kilimanjaro on time. First one is funding delays. Another one is, what if we don't get ethics approval? What if there's a problem with the data collection? What if I have a team that works with me and some of the team leaves me? I remember in COVID, we had a small team working on something, and every time somebody got COVID, for a couple of weeks, we couldn't meet and couldn't continue. But the project funders didn't care about that. The fact that we lost a team member for a while, sometimes all at the same time, didn't matter. The project needed to be completed. Some of our members in the project would be out in the field conducting field surveys. So they don't have internet availability, so that we can't meet, we can't talk. Technical failures. We can have analytical failures. We look at the data and the outcomes of the data just don't make sense, or it doesn't lead to the right outcome. What do we do then? We have to submit an article for publication, and the journal says, oh, they can't get the reviews back from the peer reviewer. What do? The stakeholders that you are engaging with are just not interested in the project. There may be legal issues. In South Africa, the POPA Act is at the moment a very serious issue. So are you meeting the grade for that? And then, of course, health, pandemic, economic issues. So if I took that list and I tried to allocate likelihood, which is low, medium, high, how likely are they to happen in my example, then I could allocate medium, low, and high in that way. You can do it differently, but let's say we did that. So once I've looked at how likely is it that we have funding delays, how likely is it that we have ethical disapproval, that we have data collection issues, all of these that are identified on the left-hand side, I write out the likelihood just as low, medium, or high. Once I've done that, I look at, so if I have funding delays, what impact does that have on my project? Of course, that has huge impact because the project can't take place if there isn't funding, right? Or if there's no ethical approval, the project can't take place. So it will be high on impact for funding delays and ethical disapproval. So in that way, after I've identified all the risk events on the left-hand side, I allocate subjectively a low, medium, or high to the likelihood and a low, medium, or high to the impact. It's better if you do this in a team and everyone in the team agrees, okay, this is medium, this is low, this is high. And once you get to this stage, you basically, just to make it easy, allocate numbers to the low, medium, and high. Now, you could say low is a 1 and medium is a 2 and high is a 3. You can say low is a 1 and medium is a 5 and high is a 10. It doesn't matter. It's a subjective way of replacing the opinions by numbers. And the reason for that is when I multiply likelihood by impact as a number, let's say medium was a 2 and impact was a high. So that will give me 2 times 3, that will give me a 6. Under priority, I would get this. So I start by identifying the risk event, go through a couple of iterations. What do I see as risk events? Then decide how likely are these to happen, low, medium, high. then decide what is the impact? What does that do to my research project? Low, medium, high. Then I superimpose numbers on the low, medium, high. However I want to. For me personally, it would be put the numbers as far apart as I can, because that makes the priority areas easier to identify. So I can say low is a 1, medium is a 10, high is a 20 if I wanted to, so long as I'm just consistent. Then I multiply the likelihoods and the impacts, and the number on the right, I know at the moment it's not a number, but I've done that already. Those numbers I can actually sort, and the ones with the highest priorities are the ones that I really need to be very careful about, because between likelihood and impact, they're now getting dangerous. Now, once I have high, medium, and lows in the priority lane, I collect them just so that it makes it easy for me. So I made the high priorities a red, the medium priorities an amber, and the low priorities a green. Now I know I need to watch out for the red ones first. They become the drum of the beat here. Then the yellow ones and the green ones are the lower ones. And then I can just write a brief strategy, just a sentence or so, to help me. What will I do with that horrible red high for funding delays? What can I do about that to mitigate that? In terms of ethical disapproval, which was amber, so it's not that much of an issue, but it's worth looking at. How do I deal with that? But start with the red ones first, the high, 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 and write a mitigation strategy. What can I do to fix that possible risk? Maybe I can't completely get rid of it, but now that I'm aware of it, what can I do to mitigate that specific risk event? How do you feel? Can you do this? Let's try this. I'm going to give you 5 minutes. In the 5 minutes, just take one risk event in your case, just one. Write down the risk event, check its likelihood, low, medium, high, check its impact, low, medium, high, multiply the two by imposing whatever numbers in order, get a priority, and write down a mitigation strategy. It's now almost 20 minutes past 3. I'm going to give us until 25 minutes past 3 to write out a risk event, see what that is as likelihood, low, medium, high, see what that pans out as impact, low, medium, high, and then multiply that as the priority and write a mitigation strategy. And just to show you, that means you will end up with one line that looks like this. You'll identify one risk event, allocate likelihood as low, medium, high, allocate impact as low, medium, and high. The lows, you will allocate a low number to, the mediums, an in-between number, and the highs, a high number, numerical number. Then when you multiply those things, those with the highs will come out high, those with the mediums will come out lower, and then we can write a mitigation strategy. So in your case, just try one risk event in your particular research and see how that line pans out. I'm going to give you until 25 minutes past 3. Thank you. Hi, I'm watching the chat. So if you want to ask a question, I'll watch the chat.
René, are you able to flick back to the slide, the previous slide? There's a query.
Yeah, I just saw. So you identify one risk event, then just focus on, let me close the other ones and see if that helps you. Just look at what is the likelihood of that event happening, low, medium, high. How possible is it that it will happen? Then once you've done that, then on impact, so if it happened, not saying it will, because the likelihood is already there, but forgetting about the likelihood. If it did happen, what is the impact of that? And then the priority. Does that help? Once you've done, just show us a thumbs up that we can see that you've done. Welcome back. I'm sorry we don't have time to go through one or two of your examples, but I'm also watching the time, so we won't discuss what you have, but we can talk about this in some other meeting in the future and see whether it makes sense for you. Can I continue? If you don't stop me, I'm just continuing, huh? So here's another very important aspect that comes into play the moment you've identified risk. And that is almost the opposite of risk, which is slack. Now, risk is identifying those events that are likely or not likely, impactful or not impactful, and then trying to mitigate for them. Slack is the extent of slack, of space, of a resource, time resource in your system that you have as almost as spare time. So slack in a way is the difference between the quickest finishing time and the latest finishing time. So if your research project has 24 months and you work out and you think you can do it at the earliest by month 20, but your latest finishing time is month 24, then you have slack in the system. And once you've identified the slack, the space in the system where things can go wrong, but it's still okay, then you have to work around what planning do I need to put in place. Now, in industrial engineering, there's a concept called drum buffer rope syndrome. And it's actually a very cool story about the man who takes his little boy and the boy's friends up the mountain on a hike. And this group of little boys and the dad walks up the mountain, and they keep on waiting for little Herbie. So Herbie is this fat little guy. He walks behind all of them. He's very slow. And somebody will shout, "Dad, Dad, Dad." Herbie's way behind again. Then the entire hiking group stops and they wait for Herbie. And the moment Herbie catches up, they start walking again, which is very unfair on Herbie. What does that mean? It means Herbie always tires because they continue the moment he's with him. They've now had a rest. He hasn't. And then they walk again. And then somebody will shout, "Dad, Dad." Herbie's behind again. And they wait for Herbie. Stop. Herbie catches up. And then they walk again. Then they realize this is not going to go well. They'll never reach the top of the end of the hike. So what they do, they stop Herbie. They say, "Herbie, let's see what you have with you. Let's share your load." They unpack Herbie's backpack. And of course, they find additional chocolates and food and pens and blankets and sunscreen and a lot of additional stuff that's in Herbie's backpack. And what they then decide to be is to be nice to Herbie. So they take this stuff from his backpack and they share that amongst the little group. So everyone in the group now has some additional load because they're sharing Herbie's backpack. And now it's like, let's walk now, we'll be okay. And they start walking now that they're all sharing part of Herbie's backpack. And lo and behold, Herbie is still behind. Why? Because he's fat and unfit. So they stop again. Sharing his load didn't help. So what they then do is they put Herbie in front of the hiking trail. And what then happens is the drum of the beat, the extent to which the group can move up the hill, is based on the ability of Herbie to walk. So elevate the constraint, the slowest, the most dangerous part of the project, and make sure that that slowest part, the most problematic part, can work. And once that slowest part can work, everything else then will work. So the advantage of slack is obviously you're building contingency planning, better resource allocation. The quality will be better because you are making provision for possible delays by checking where slack in the system anyway, and then managing for that slack. Let's see how this pans out. So here's typical activities in research. Now, tell me, could there be slack in your literature review? I.e., could there be place in your literature review where the slack can take place, but it doesn't matter? I.e., is the literature review critical to the research project or not? Anyone? A yes or a no? A yes or a no? Is the literature critical? It's not on the critical path because you can continue to conduct the literature review while other activities take place. It's not a necessary and sufficient thing to happen. So it might take you longer and you'll have to make provision for the literature review, but it's not on the critical path of activities that you need to do to get to the end line. You remember when I asked you to draw a line and then all the milestones of your research project lie on the line from the beginning to the end? The literature review doesn't need to be on that critical path. What about the data collection and analysis? Is that on the critical path? Is that critical to the completion of the project and it won't hold up or it will hold up all others? Or is there some slack in the data collection and analysis? What do you think? Anyone? Well said. Data collection becomes a problem. You cannot conduct the analyses of the data if you've not undertaken the data collection. So if there's a problem with the data collection, there's no slack in that getting to the data analyses. What about the last one? Ethical approval. Is that on the critical path? Is that critical for the research? Yeah. If you don't get ethical approval, you cannot conduct the research. It's one of the critical components. There's no slack in that system. So the only slack here was in terms of the literature review. Now I'm going to give you an exercise. So we're now going to go to Mentimeter. It looks like this. There we go. And I'm giving you some concepts. Sorry, the first one is a concept. And I'm asking you whether you think this has some dependencies in it. So if you go to, at the top on the right-hand side, www.menti.com, on a device, you can use your phone. And then when you ask for that, type in the code 89748883. You will get to this question, and it will ask you which of these have dependencies in them in your research project, or you can just scan the code here on the screen with your phone. It will also take you to Mentimeter. And once you're in Mentimeter, it will ask you, does literature review have dependencies? Is that on the critical path? Are objectives and scope on the critical path? Is assembling a team on the critical path? Is identifying the research methods on the critical path? And then we'll see the results here and we can talk about that. So please enjoy. Go to www.menti.com. When you're prompted, put in the code 89748883. Thank you, Luther. There we go. So one person said they all are on the critical path. So 2 of you have responded. Only 1 said the literature review and the assemble the team are on the critical path. Now this gives us, when these results come in, this gives us a sense of what do you think? What are the really critical stuff where we need to make sure we spend sufficient time on? So 4 of you have answered, and you're saying the 2 most important ones are objectives and scope, and identifying the research methods. And the least important ones so far are the team and the literature review. Any more coming in? Yeah. I can see we're saturating on the same things. The objectives and the scope of the project, and you're right, are really strong. They need to work. If the objectives and the scope don't work, if the research method doesn't work, then there's a critical element in the research not being able to complete successfully. See, 9 of you have completed. So the objectives and the scope become the most important aspects, followed by the research method. Does somebody want to explain how they made their decisions here? Why did you say what you said? Clearly, 10 of you said the objectives and the scope are the most important parts. Why did you say so? Or why do you think the literature review is not, other than I just said so? Because that holds the entire research project together, doesn't it? It follows on what we discussed earlier today, the researchable problem, followed by the scope and the objectives of the research. If that doesn't work, then nothing else will work. The literature review can continue. It's not on the critical path. Anyone else who wants to contribute to that, or can I continue because there's 2 more of this? So for those who've submitted this, here's the second one. Which steps are on the critical path out of these? So you do the same, you go to Mentimeter, or if you've submitted the previous one, it will come to the next one. And you can just do the same that you did just now. You can just make your choices, and it will show on the screen. Are you making it work on Mentimeter? Aha. Somebody says the most important aspect is funding. Critical element, yeah. Well, there are some research projects that you can do without having funding, but in an applied field, that's not easy to do. Anyone else? There we go. There we go. 4 people responded. So when I finalize the presentation to Julia and Natalie, I'll send them this version with your comments in. So the PowerPoint presentation will then show what you said here. So why would you say engaged stakeholders would be on the critical path? Why are we saying that is the major one? Engage with the stakeholders. Why is that so prominent? Anyone? Because the engaged stakeholders go almost right through. It talks to science outreach, the value of the research. It's possibly the target of the data collection. And it's also, once the data collection takes place and you want to validate your findings, you validate that with stakeholders. Also, stakeholders would include the funders. So that's a very, very important aspect of the research. Anyone else wants to contribute? Right, I've got a last one for you, and then we'll discuss that. Last one, last 3. If I could get them all on one slide, I would have done that, but unfortunately, Mentimeter wanted me to split them up. So sorry that it goes into 3 stages. So this is the 3rd set. So if you press submit on the previous one, it'll get you to this one. Thank you. So critical elements are the dissemination of the results, the possible recommendation for policy, and then the post-project reviews. All equal. All animals remain equal here. So while this takes place, why are you saying what you're saying? You can continue providing stuff here. I just want to show you what the previous results were. This was our first one. First one with the highest here was the objectives and identify the research methods. On the second group, it was to engage the stakeholders. And then on the third group, it's the dissemination of the results. Why are you saying what you're saying? Anyone? All right. The last part of my presentation will talk to network diagrams, and then we will be discussing that and apply that before we finish, hopefully by 4. So a network diagram takes all these tasks that we've been talking about, all these possible dependencies, and what I've already said, develop a critical path in a visual representation. So it shows you what it looks like to take the tasks, to present them in a line, to check which of these tasks are dependent on one before and which can take place consecutively. And then work out a plan where you can see it. Now, if you're like me, you want to see this physically, you want to see the picture of this, and then you have a visual way of looking at what the project is wanting you to do, because research is a project. Research is a project because there's an anticipated outcome. And because of that anticipated outcome, we plan through the rear view mirror. We plan with the end in mind. And network diagrams provide a very good, useful visual tool of picturing the project of your research, showing the activities, the timelines, the dependencies, and then the critical path, which is the fastest way to go through this and get to the end result. So here are some of the activities that we want to do in research. We want to identify the topic, identify the research task, then look where are these tasks in terms of depending on each other. Then we need to find out how long will each task take. Normally, if you work on a project, you sit together and say, okay, this will take us more or less so long, this will take us more or less so long. Then we construct that critical path and we identify the timelines, the milestones and the timelines, and then we just manage the project from that perspective. So what the critical path analysis will do is to present us with this visual picture that shows the entire project and indicates where are we now and where should we have been if something did not go wrong. So it's actually the sequence of the tasks that would help us to get to the overall completion. And there's also some slack in the critical path, which identifies where we have some space if something does go wrong. I'm hoping I'm not saying something it does make sense to you. So an example of a critical path could be writing down all the activities, which I've done here for you. And then in the table next to that, putting how long will each one take. So identify the tasks and then right next to what do you understand, how long will each one take? Now, I don't have time for us to do the exercise, but can you visualize taking the table, identifying the tasks, and then next to saying funding will take me about 2 months, ethical approval will take me about 3 months, planning the research will take us a month, the data collection will take us 6 months, and just write all of that down, total it up, and that's the total time of the project, but it may not be the same as the total time required for you to conduct the research project in. And if those two are out of sync, then where can we find dependencies or independencies in the system, i.e., tasks that can happen at the same time to save time. I hope you're all still with me. So let's see how this pans out. Now, here is just a drawing I made of that. Now, let me just go back, and you can see it's exactly the same. So I took the example of the possible task activities in planning a research project, and I made a drawing in PowerPoint. Forget about the alphabet letters. Just to show what this critical path looks like from the tasks there. And they actually are all in sequence. You'll see they start with the funding, then the ethical proposal, then the research plan, then the pilot study, then the data collection, the peer review, writing a paper, interpreting everything, data analysis. There they go, all in sequence, which is bothersome because it means there's no slack in the system. There's nothing that happens at the same time. This is the critical path, one after the other after the other. So in terms of Herbie the bottleneck, if one of these activities can't take place in the allowable time, and that allowable time we had in this table, then we cannot complete the project on time. So one needs to know this so that you can plan if there's anything here that you need to pre-mitigate according to the risk matrix. How will you do that? Here are some of the methods that we can use. So the two methods that we mostly use are PERT diagrams and critical path methods or critical path analyses. And either one of them, in the cases that you will probably do, will work. Either a PERT diagram or a critical path diagram. Normally a PERT diagram is used for projects that are not routine, whereas CPM, critical path methods, are used for repetitive projects that you just always do the same thing. So you have a fixed plan and you fit into that plan always. Your research for academic studies will probably use a CPM because it's a well-defined structure on how you conduct the research. Another thing to look at is time versus cost to see if you use a PERT or a CPM. Because the CPM is easier in terms of cost and time. The PERT diagram allows for more flexibility, and it can also handle more complex problems or projects than the CPM. But from your perspective, PERT or CPM will both work as a way of drawing a critical path to show what the project looks like. And here's a typical example. This is a critical path diagram. Look at the image. So what it does, it identifies all the tasks, all the activities that need to take place. And the critical path, that's the important thing, which is marked in here in green here, is the longest sequence of dependent tasks, either one follows on the other, that will determine the project duration. Now, that doesn't say that task F, G, and H are not important. They are. It just means that the longest path, if I added times to all of those tasks, the longest path is the one that allows for the critical path. The others all need to take place, but they don't get to the longest path. And it also indicates that task F, G, and H can take place at the same time as tasks B, C, D, up to N. B, C, and D are longer in execution than F and G or H. So I'll stop a moment just to be sure that you're all with me. So critical path writes down all the activities. Then it tries to draw it by hand. At this point, we're drawing it by hand. These activities using the times to completion of every activity A, B, C, D, F, G, H, up to the outcome, which is E. It also takes note of which things can happen at the same time. in this case, F, B, and H can happen at the same time. That's why they're on different paths. G is after F, but H only has A before it. So I could say the critical path is from A to F to G to E, or I could say the critical path is A to H to E, but those paths are shorter than the long path in the green from A to B to C to D to E. It doesn't say that F and G or H do not take place. It says that the longest path that gives you the most space, slack, is the one that takes the longest to ensure that the task is completed in the shortest possible time. I don't know how that sits with you, but that's as best as I can describe it. Do you have questions for me? Let's see. Does it make sense what I just said? Anyone? So I can add to that, we just did the critical path. Here's a PERT diagram. So the PERT diagram is the same as the CPM. Remember, the PERT diagram handles more complex research projects. The CPM is a very simple, linear way of looking at the shortest path to finishing the project. The PERT diagram has the advantage that it can also include uncertainties, but because it goes for complex problems, you'll see the drawing becomes far more complex. Starting with, start here, go there, and in how many months can I finish the project? So that's probably not necessary in your cases. I think if you take a drawing and you make a critical path diagram, identifying all the tasks, seeing what activities follow on which, then, and draw this and work out the time to completion, which we'll do now, you will probably get a good result. So here's an application of that. So here's a process with all the tasks taking place. So there's from conceptualization to funding and proposals up to, in this case, data analysis, dissemination, and the sustainability of the project. And in each case, I added how long each one of these activities will take. From conceptualization to funding takes 7 days. From funding and approval to detailed planning takes 21 days. From detailed planning to data collection takes 31 days. And as we continue, the times to completion of that task is here. Also, what I didn't say is I've already indicated in this what the sequence should be. There's nothing that can take place before something else. So this is the critical path. Every one of these tasks are dependent on anyone else. Where's the only part I can save? If you look at this drawing, come on. It's a Wednesday afternoon. I have a meeting after this one, so we'll close soon. But tell me, where is in this can I make a change? Where can I save space? If you look at this, where do you think we can save space? Given that you don't have to bother about the specific times, where can I save space? Anyone? Come on.
I think between data collection and data analysis.
Good. How so? Perfect. How so? How would you do that? What can you do between data collection and data analysis to save time? So let's say that data collection at the moment is 122 days, okay? The pilot is an additional 30 days. That data collection is 122 days. Let's say that was a survey. No, let's say that was interviews. So if I change that research design in terms of the data collection to a mixed method approach, mixed methods being I mix quantitative and qualitative in general terms, data collections, I can conduct in triangulation, for instance, interviews and surveys at the same time and probably get a more validated, reliable result out of the data collection than if I used only one method and the entire process of 122 days is dependent on that one data collection method. Am I right? Do 1 and 3 together, Amanda says 1 and 3. Yes, you can probably do the conceptualization and the detailed planning together as well to save time. That's if you had sufficient time at the beginning to do the conceptualization and bring that through into the detailed planning, but well said, well said. So once you've identified all the tasks and you write out the possible times to completion, you look at that picture and say, oh dear, this does not work out to the time I have available. So I cannot make this happen. What can I do to save time? Maybe not in the days, because then I'm going to compromise quality, but maybe in terms of what activities can happen at the same time and what cannot. Julia and Natalie, I just want to know how we are for time, because I need a little bit more time, probably up to 10 minutes past 4 to continue.
Hi, René. That's fine. We can keep the meeting running. If anyone does need to jump off at 4 sharp, I'll just reiterate that we will be sharing both the recording as well as the slides. But if you guys can hang on for a few more minutes, please do. So you can continue, René.
I appreciate that. Thanks, Julia. And thank you, everyone, for your patience with this. I would rather do a good job than just leave you hanging in the air here. I've actually also just extended my next commitment to 4:15 to make time for this. So another thing we can do, other than to draw the nodes, as we call them, the tasks and the times to completion, and then seeing what can happen at the same time, is to do a Gantt chart. Now, a Gantt chart you may not be unfamiliar with. It normally looks like on the right-hand side. So you'll identify the tasks. You'll show, you can do this in Excel, the times to completion. You can easily then see what can happen at the same time. So where are the milestones and where are the dependencies in the system? What is dependent on an activity before it? And which of these activities, you can see in both my examples here, can happen at the same time so that the project finishes within the time that is needed. So a Gantt chart is a standard activity. What it does need, I have some freeware tools for you, is to identify those activities and work out what comes first. And that brings me to, let's try this. And I'm going to finish this within the time up to 4:10. And then I'm going to make my email available if anybody needs any clarification of anything there. So we're now going to try and make this work. So if you think of your own example, just get yourself in your head to what is an example that I have in my case that I need to work on. So it's now over to you. Then write down for your case these activities. And once you have the list of activities, which we've done earlier on today here in a table, then right next to that, how long will each one of these tasks take you in that table? And then also indicate what happens before something else. It's called a predecessor table. You'll see here, I tried my best to show that, because most of the activities we've shown now happened the one after the other. they were all dependent. Maybe there are certain of the tasks that don't need a previous task before it, so we can do them at the same time. Like we spoke about now when we try to save time on our project in yellow. So you write a table, you identify the tasks in the table, you add what are the times to completion for every task, then you add in that table what needs to happen before what. And you write all of that down in a table that will look like this. Now, you don't need to do that, but you're welcome to try this and then show me what it looks like if you want to. And once you've done that, draw by hand before you apply your mind to some of the online tools. Just try and draw the project on a piece of paper and see how this pans out and do the calculation of the total time to completion of that. Now you can do this for complex processes as well, but we're trying to keep it simple here. So I'm going to show you 2 examples, and then I'll close, of how you use that. So here are the milestones on the left-hand side for my first example. So that's what we've been working up with so far. Project start, then define the research topic, secure the funding, finalize the research plan, complete the pilot study, complete the data collection. That's the standard tasks in the research project. Now, I can write that in a table. See what I did? Firstly, I wrote down the tasks on the left-hand side. Then on the right-hand column, I added how many days will each one take. And it ended up with 333 days. That's my project time. Then I looked at the dependencies, and that's what the A to B and the B to C means. I said A needs to go to B. Project start goes to define research project. B goes to C. Define the research topic, you need to, goes to secure the funding, etc. So every one of these tasks on the left-hand side go to the next task. They're all dependent on the previous one. That's my table on dependencies. So that gives me 333 days. Now, in my language, that means the critical path in this example is 333 days. There's no slack because there's nothing that can happen at the same time as something else. So I need a complete 333 days to complete this project by adding up all the tasks for all the events that need to take place, which is a very dangerous situation to be in because nothing can go wrong. Everything is dependent on something else. But now let's say we change that example. So here I've done that. I take that same example, but I break up the data collection into surveys and focus groups that can happen at the same time. So it's that same list of activities on the left-hand side, but now I've taken task F, which is the data collection, and broke it up into F1 and F2, which is the survey data collection, the quantitative one, and the focus group data collection, F2. And that gives me, if I use the same times to completion as before, but I broke up the data collection, that gives me, you won't believe me, less days in completion. So by writing up the tasks and the dependencies and seeing that it takes me 333 days, then looking what can happen at the same time, allocating the days to the different activities in yellow based on what can happen at the same time, that brings down, look at this, isn't this fantastic? This brings it down to 301 days. Ha! There's still no slack, but what I have done is I have shortened the time to completion. In my new version, the things that can happen at the same time I've already taken care of. There's no slack, but I've brought down the number of days to completion to 301 days, which means the funder will be happier with what I've done. I can even draw that. So here's that project with all the task activities here with the times to completion of all the tasks. And I can visually see where the tasks take place that happen at the same time, which is F1 and F2, the data collection. And now the total number of days is 301, and I can mark off as I continue with the project. I've done A, I've done B, I've done C, I've done D, I've done F1 or F2 or both. That leads me to G, which is the data analysis, the synthesis of the data, up to the final result, L. Now, isn't that smart? And with that, drop off the beat, I get to Julia, my last slide, which is, so tell me, what does good research planning look like, and what does bad research planning look like? If you're wanting to plan the research to go well, what is it that you do in the green block? If you don't want to care about the research, what is it that you don't need to do or not look at in the red block? Anyone want to hazard anything here? What is it that you need to do for good research planning? It's checking for dependencies, checking the tasks and the times to completion, making sure you leave nothing out, checking for slack. If there's slack, then there's some resilience in the project that you can work with. If there's not, then not going to happen. And once you've worked out your plan, good research planning will, then your research can only go well. So I leave you with Alice in Wonderland. Would you tell me, please, which way I ought to go from here? And the cat answers Alice, that depends a good deal on where you want to go. And Alice says, I don't much care where. And the cat says, then it doesn't matter which way you go. That is not research. That is not research. Thank you very much, Julia and Natalie. I am finished.
Thank you so much, René. That was a very, very interesting and useful presentation. I think we can all agree. I can also see some of the comments in the chat that, people are saying that this is very useful. So thank you for sharing, those foundations of project management, and in particular, the tools that you shared with us. I won't talk too long now just because we are over time, but just to say again, thank you so much to all of you who joined us today, and we will be sharing both the presentation slides as well as the recording of this webinar in the next day or two. So just keep a lookout for your emails. We have all of your emails from when you registered for the webinar, so we will be sharing those. Natalie, do you have any final items that you want to address or things you want to say?
I'd just like to again say thank you very much to our guest speaker, Professor René Pellissier, as well as yourself, Julia, and all the delegates that joined. We do hope that it was a very informative session, which we do also think it was.